For more than 75 years, the world's most powerful countries have possessed the ability to wipe each other off the map. They've fought brutal proxy wars, waged economic and ideological battles, and come terrifyingly close to the edge of open conflict again and again. And yet, there's been no World War III. In fact, this has been one of the longest periods of peace between major powers in modern history. How is that possible? The answer is a paradox. The most destructive weapons ever created may also be the most effective ones for preventing war, at least a certain kind of war. This is the strange and often unsettling logic of nuclear deterrence, a strategy built not on using weapons, but on threatening to use them. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, it dropped a second bomb on the city of Nagasaki. Together, the two attacks killed more than 100,000 people almost instantly, and many more died from radiation in the weeks and months that followed. This was the first, and so far the only time, nuclear weapons have been used. But in that moment, the nature of war itself changed. For most of human history, wars, however brutal, had limits. A state could be defeated, cities might fall, but the world wouldn't end. For the first time, we had weapons capable of wiping out entire populations and ending civilizations. And as these weapons proliferated, first to the Soviet Union, then to other powers, military strategists and political leaders had to grapple with a new reality, that a full-scale war between nuclear states would be unwinnable, and that survival would depend not on superior firepower, but on preventing war altogether. Nuclear weapons didn't just raise the stakes of war, they flipped the logic of strategy on its head. In a conventional war, the objective is to defeat the enemy. In a nuclear war, the objective is to make sure no one ever wants to fight in the first place. This is the foundation of deterrence, the idea that the best way to avoid war is to convince your opponent that starting a war would guarantee their own destruction. This strategy rests on a few core principles. The first is mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The concept is simple and terrifying. If both sides have enough nuclear weapons to survive a first strike and then retaliate, then neither side has an incentive to attack, because any attack would be suicidal. Peace is maintained not through trust, but through fear. The key to making MAD credible is the ability to absorb a nuclear attack and then still strike back, called a second strike capability. If a country believed it could destroy its opponent's arsenal in a single surprise attack, then it might be tempted to go first. This is prevented by diversifying nuclear forces through the nuclear triad. This triad is composed of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, sea-based submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, and strategic bombers. The idea of the triad is strategic redundancy, that even if two legs of the triad were destroyed, the third could still retaliate, making a disarming first strike impossible. And that triad is important to maintain strategic credibility. For deterrence to work, it's not enough just to have the weapons. You have to convince your opponent that you're willing and able to use them. This creates a dangerous paradox. To prevent war, you have to threaten the unthinkable and convince your rival that you mean it. Deterrence in theory is elegant, but in practice it's risky because it depends on psychology, perception, and communication under extreme pressure. While the logic of deterrence rests on fear and strategic calculation, some scholars argue there's another reason nuclear weapons haven't been used since 1945, a powerful norm against their use. Nina Tannenwald calls this the nuclear taboo, a norm that views the use of nuclear weapons as morally and politically unacceptable. From this perspective, restraint isn't just about rationality or the second strike capabilities, it's also about identity, legitimacy, and international norms. Leaders may see nuclear use not only as catastrophic, but as violating deeply held global standards. To be clear, this norm doesn't replace deterrence, but it adds another layer of restraint, based not on strategy, but on identity, values, and international expectations. The Cold War was the crucible in which nuclear deterrence was born and tested. For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union lived under the constant threat of nuclear war, forcing their strategies to evolve. The US monopoly on nuclear weapons lasted just 4 years, until the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949. This forced the United States to develop its first coherent nuclear strategy, massive retaliation. Articulated in 1954, the doctrine stated that the US would respond to any Soviet military provocation, even a conventional one, at places and with means of our own choosing, meaning with overwhelming nuclear force. This strategy, however, suffered from a critical flaw, a lack of credibility. Would the US really risk a nuclear holocaust over a limited skirmish in Europe? The question came to a head during the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. When U.S. intelligence discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, the world stood on the brink for 13 days. In the end, diplomacy prevailed, but the crisis proved that massive retaliation was too blunt an instrument and that a more flexible approach was needed to avoid accidental annihilation. As a result, the United States shifted to a doctrine of flexible response. The idea was to maintain a range of military options, both conventional and nuclear, to respond appropriately to different levels of aggression. This also introduced two competing targeting strategies: a counter-force strategy targeted an opponent's military-industrial infrastructure to undermine their ability to wage war, and a counter-value strategy that targeted an opponent's population and cities. This was the true heart of deterrence, making a nuclear war too costly to fight. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had achieved strategic parity with the United States. With both sides capable of destroying each other many times over, the logic of mutually assured destruction, MAD, became accepted reality. This standoff, sometimes called the balance of terror, is often credited for preventing a direct military conflict between the superpowers. But living on a knife's edge fueled a desire for stability, leading both sides to the negotiating table. At the peak of the Cold War arms race, their combined nuclear arsenals exceeded 60,000 weapons, enough to destroy the planet many, many times over. Recognizing the danger and expense, both superpowers began pursuing arms control agreements not to eliminate weapons, but to manage the risk. Arguably the most important agreement in this area is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. Negotiated in 1968, the NPT is based on a three-part agreement. First, non-nuclear states agree not to acquire nuclear weapons. Second, nuclear-armed states agree to move towards total nuclear disarmament at the earliest possible date. And third, all states retain the right to pursue the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. As of 2025, 191 states are party to the NPT. 4 countries, India, Israel, Pakistan, and South Sudan, have not signed the treaty and are therefore not subject to its provisions. And North Korea initially joined the agreement but withdrew in 2003, subsequently developing and testing nuclear weapons. Today, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is under strain. The core bargain of the NPT is that non-nuclear states will forego developing nuclear weapons in exchange for the original 5 nuclear powers working in good faith towards complete disarmament. This is subject to Article 6. Many non-nuclear states argue that the nuclear powers are not fulfilling their end of the bargain, instead spending billions of dollars to modernize their existing arsenals. This creates a deep sense of frustration and erodes the treaty's credibility. North Korea's withdrawal and subsequent nuclear tests created a dangerous precedent. Further, concerns about Iran's nuclear program, while it remains party to the NPT, have created significant tension and distrust, highlighting the challenges of verification and enforcement when a country is suspected of noncompliance. The return of great power competition, particularly between the United States, Russia, and China, has chilled the atmosphere for arms control. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its associated nuclear threats have shattered security assurances and led some non-nuclear states to question whether they're safer without their own deterrent. The collapse of other crucial treaties, like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force or INF Treaty, weakens the overall framework of global arms control, putting more pressure on the NPT as the central pillar. The NPT review conferences, held every 5 years, have recently failed to produce consensus outcome documents, for example in 2015 and again in 2022. This is a clear symptom of the deep divisions between the member states and their ability to agree on a path forward, further weakening the institution. And for many states in the global south, these frustrations go even deeper. They argue that the current nuclear order reflects a colonial hierarchy where a handful of powerful countries retain the right to possess the most destructive weapons ever created, while the rest of the world is asked to accept their permanent vulnerability. This critique has fueled growing support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a UN treaty that bans the development, possession, and use of nuclear weapons. While no nuclear-armed states have signed it, the TPNW reflects a powerful moral and political stance that the only truly safe number of nuclear weapons is 0. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, marked the first formal efforts by the United States and the Soviet Union to cap the growth of their nuclear arsenals. SALT I, signed in 1972, froze the number of strategic ballistic missile launchers and led to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. SALT II aimed to limit warhead-carrying delivery systems, but was never ratified by the U.S. Senate, largely due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Still, both sides informally observed its limits for years. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty restricted both the U.S. and the USSR to 2 missile defense sites each, later reduced to 1, effectively preserving the logic of mutually assured destruction. By preventing either side from building systems to intercept nuclear missiles, the treaty reduced incentives for a first strike. The U.S. withdrew from the treaty in 2002, citing the need to develop defenses against rogue states and terrorist threats. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed by Reagan and Gorbachev, eliminated an entire class of ground-based ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. It was the first treaty to include intrusive on-site inspections, and it helped ease Cold War tensions in Europe. The United States formally withdrew in 2019 after accusing Russia of violating the treaty by developing prohibited weapons systems. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START I, was signed in 1991 and was the most comprehensive arms control agreement ever, cutting deployed strategic warheads and delivery vehicles by the thousands. It was followed by subsequent agreements, culminating in New START in 2010, which limited both sides to 1,550 deployed warheads and included robust verification measures. As of now, New START is the last remaining bilateral nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia, and its future is uncertain. The United States and Russia still dominate the nuclear landscape today, accounting for about 90% of all warheads. While their arsenals have shrunk from Cold War peaks over 31,000 and 40,000 respectively, they still retain formidable stockpiles. Today, the United States maintains a nuclear stockpile of around 5,200 warheads, and Russia maintains a similar nuclear stockpile, estimated to be around 5,500 warheads, though limited funding and maintenance raises questions about the effectiveness of its arsenal. The United Kingdom secured the nuclear bomb in 1952, and at its peak maintained around 500 warheads. Today it has 225. France became a nuclear power in 1960 and developed a stockpile of about 500 warheads by the early 1990s. Today, it has around 290. China became a nuclear power in 1964 and gradually expanded its nuclear stockpile to its current levels of about 600 warheads. While these 5 countries, who are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, are the only recognized nuclear powers under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, several other countries have nuclear weapons today. Israel developed the weapon in the early 1970s and is believed to have around 90 warheads today, though officially, the government maintains a policy of nuclear ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying its nuclear arsenal. India developed theirs in 1974 and has about 180 warheads today. Pakistan developed theirs in the early 1980s and has a similar number as India. North Korea detonated its first warhead in 2006 and today has an estimated 50 warheads. And Iran is widely believed to be close to developing nuclear weapons, though as of mid-2025 has not yet developed such weapon systems. Finally, South Africa developed a small nuclear arsenal in the 1980s, but voluntarily dismantled it before the end of apartheid, making it the only country to both develop and then fully give up nuclear weapons. Despite the risks, states continue to pursue nuclear weapons for 3 main reasons. First, they provide security against powerful adversaries. For states that can't match their rivals in conventional military strength, nuclear weapons act as the ultimate deterrent. North Korea, for example, sees its nuclear stockpile as a survival guarantee against the United States. Nuclear weapons also serve as symbols of power. They signal that a country is technologically advanced and deserving of a seat at the global table. Finally, in regions with long-standing rivalries like South Asia or the Middle East, one state's nuclear program often prompts its neighbors to follow suit. Pakistan's nuclear program, for example, was a direct response to India's, and India's program was partly shaped by its rivalry with China. But here's the paradox. The period when a country is developing nuclear weapons is often its most vulnerable. Before a state has a nuclear arsenal with a second strike capability, it may be seen as provocative but still attackable. Iran is a prime example. For years, Israel and U.S. officials have debated and even conducted military strikes to prevent Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold. But once a country has a bomb and can use it in retaliation, the risk of external attack often drops dramatically. This creates what some scholars refer to as a proliferation risk curve, or a proliferation instability window, a period of maximum risk when fears of preemptive strikes, miscalculation, or sabotage are at their highest. So, while nuclear weapons may offer security and prestige, the path to acquiring them is dangerous, not just for the country in question, but often for the entire region. The spread of nuclear weapons and the pressure to maintain a hair-trigger retaliatory posture meant that both sides were constantly watching for an attack. Throughout the Cold War, the world came perilously close to disaster by mistake on numerous occasions. On October 5, 1960, a U.S. radar outpost in Greenland misinterpreted a moonrise over Norway as a massive Soviet missile launch, prompting NORAD to go on high alert. Only the fact that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was in New York for a meeting of the United Nations led to a questioning of the launch detection and an American stand-down. On November 24, 1961, the American Strategic Air Command headquarters lost communication with NORAD and a large number of ballistic missile early warning sites. These sites were intended to operate independently, so loss of communications with so many of them at once was interpreted as the result of a coordinated Soviet first strike. SAC ordered the launch of all nuclear bomber forces, but that order was rescinded after it was discovered that the loss of communication was the result of the loss of power to a single communications relay facility. On October 27, 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet patrol submarine, the B-59, interpreted the dropping of practice depth charges by the USS Beale as a real attack against the Soviet submarine. Unable to confirm with Moscow, the crew prepared to launch a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo against the American fleet. The submarine's commander, Vasily Arkhipov, goes against orders and refuses to launch the torpedo without confirmation from Moscow, likely preventing a full-scale nuclear war. On November 9, 1979, NORAD detected an initial Soviet launch of 250 ballistic missiles, followed immediately by the launch of another 2,200 missiles. A decision to launch a retaliatory strike had to be made within 7 minutes, or the American missiles would be destroyed on the ground. Bombers were scrambled, and the decision to launch American nuclear missiles was being made. 6 minutes after the initial detection of a Soviet launch, it was determined that a war training program had accidentally been loaded into an operational computer, essentially the plot from the movie War Games. On September 23, 1983, a Soviet early warning system detected the launch of 6 American Minuteman missiles against targets in the Soviet Union. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who was responsible for monitoring American launches, refused to order a Soviet retaliatory strike until computer reports could be independently verified by Soviet ground radar sites. His decision likely prevented the outbreak of World War III, and if you want to see a good movie about him, check out The Man Who Saved the World on Netflix. And this list isn't even complete. It doesn't include more than 30 times a nuclear weapon was accidentally dropped or lost, or the hundreds of attempts to smuggle weapons-grade nuclear material. These incidents created immense pressure to improve communication and to reduce the hair-trigger alert status of nuclear arsenals. Deterrence isn't a one-size-fits-all strategy. Today, the world's nuclear powers follow different playbooks, which can be grouped into 3 main approaches. First, there's the strategy of calculated ambiguity. The United States, the United Kingdom, and France all intentionally reject a no-first-use policy. By leaving their options open, they seek to deter not just nuclear attacks, but also overwhelming conventional, chemical, or biological assaults against themselves or their allies. This ambiguity is the foundation of extended deterrence, the nuclear umbrella that protects NATO, Japan, and South Korea. Second is the doctrine of assured retaliation. China has declared a no-first-use policy, pledging only to use nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear attack. India has a similar policy, though it reserves the right to retaliate with nuclear weapons against a major chemical or biological attack. For both, the goal is not to manage conventional war, but to guarantee that any nuclear aggressor will face a devastating second strike. And finally, there's the strategy of asymmetric defense, used by states to offset perceived disadvantages in conventional military power. Pakistan, for example, explicitly reserves the right to use nuclear weapons first to deter a large-scale Indian invasion. Russia employs a more complex version of this strategy. While its official doctrine permits the use of nuclear weapons only when the very existence of the state is threatened, many analysts believe that it maintains an escalate to de-escalate posture. This is the threat of using limited, low-yield nuclear strikes early in a conflict to shock an adversary into backing down, thereby controlling the conflict's outcome on Russia's terms. These differing doctrines create a complex and unpredictable global landscape where one country's idea of deterrence may look like aggression to another. Today we've entered what many analysts call a new nuclear age, a far more complex, fragmented, and dangerous environment. One of the greatest fears in the post-9/11 world is that nuclear weapons or nuclear materials might fall into the hands of non-state actors. Unlike states, terrorist groups can't be deterred in the traditional sense. They don't hold territory, populations, or infrastructure that can be threatened in return. A nuclear-armed terrorist group wouldn't need ICBMs, just a smuggled device or a dirty bomb, and the consequences would be catastrophic. This is why nuclear security, tracking fissile materials, securing stockpiles, and preventing trafficking, has become such a major global priority. We're also seeing the nuclear regime beginning to break down. The ABM treaty is gone, the INF treaty is gone, New START, the last remaining bilateral arms control agreement between the United States and Russia, is set to expire in 2026 and looks likely not to be renewed. In many cases, treaties have failed because mutual accusations of cheating, a lack of trust, or a belief that the strategic environment has changed too much for the old rules to still apply. But as arms control collapses, so too do transparency mechanisms, communications channels, and limits on destabilizing systems, raising the risk of miscalculations or a new arms race. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty is weakened by the slow pace of disarmament by nuclear powers, North Korea's withdrawal, and the failure of recent review conferences to reach consensus. During the Cold War, arms control was largely bilateral between the United States and the Soviet Union. But today, the nuclear landscape is increasingly multipolar. Countries like China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and potentially others are expanding their capabilities with very different strategic doctrines. Most of these states are not part of traditional arms control agreements, and some, like North Korea, are completely outside the global non-proliferation regime. Crafting agreements that include all of these actors is far more difficult, but increasingly necessary. And the tensions between major nuclear powers are increasing. In this new era, nuclear modernization is accelerating, especially in the United States, Russia, and China. Countries are developing new delivery systems, including hypersonic glide vehicles that fly too fast and too low to be intercepted, tactical and low-yield nuclear weapons designed for limited battlefield use, and more flexible nuclear doctrines, especially in Russia's case, where escalate to de-escalate is now a central concept. At the same time, China is expanding and diversifying its nuclear arsenal, signaling a possible shift away from its traditional posture of minimum deterrence. These developments raise the troubling possibility of a return not just to strategic deterrence, but to nuclear warfighting doctrine, the idea that nuclear weapons might be used in limited or winnable ways. On top of that, a new wave of emerging technologies is creating additional instability. Hypersonic missiles compress decision-making time, reducing the window for diplomacy or verification. Cyber attacks could disable nuclear warning systems or spoof missile launches, increasing the risk of false alarms. AI and autonomous weapon systems might be used in targeting, threat assessment, or even weapons deployment, potentially reducing human oversight in high-stakes scenarios. And space-based infrastructure, like satellites used for early warning and command and control, are increasingly vulnerable to disruption or attack. These technologies are often invisible, hard to verify, and poorly regulated, yet they sit at the center of nuclear decision-making. But perhaps most worrying is the decline in the arms control mindset itself. Where previous generations saw treaties as stabilizing, today's leaders, particularly in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, often see them as constraints on freedom of action. As great power competition returns, there's less political will to limit capabilities and more emphasis on demonstrating strength. And in this environment, Arms control is primarily a political and ideological challenge rather than a technological one. Some scholars argue that the stability of the Cold War was an exception, not the rule. In the new nuclear age, deterrence may be less stable, crises may escalate more quickly, and the margin for error may be much, much smaller. So, while the Cold War's nuclear balance was terrifying, it was at least structured. Today, we face a nuclear landscape that is far more unpredictable and potentially more dangerous.